Good morning and welcome to Resistance Seminars. My name is Eric Clark and you have joined me for a 12 noon Eastern broadcast that I do each week. Different times if you're in different time zones on the West Coast, so it's 9 a.m. where I am at. And we have been working our way through this book, Faithful Resistance, Gospel Visions for the Church in a Time of Empire by Rick Ufford-Chase. I helped edit and contribute to this book, and a whole lot of other contributors wrote into this book. And we have visited with each of them over the course of the last 10 weeks and had just marvelous conversations about the process that went into this, their thoughts behind it, how this impacts their work going on in society, and lots of questions have come up. And I've been responding to questions from people in the live stream as well. And hopefully some of you will get on and ask us questions today. And today our goal is to sort of summarize, close up, do give some closing thoughts to this study process that we've gone through. And I'm really, really grateful to have Rick Ufford-Chase back with us to help us in that. So, hey, Rick, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Eric. It's great to be back in the conversation again.
Yeah, and so we have been through all the chapters and we have talked through all the content except the last chapter, which is about, it's a little bit more specific to the Presbyterian context than some of the others. And it was written for us, the introductory part of it was written for us by J. Herbert Nelson, who is currently the stated clerk of our denomination. He was not stated clerk when he wrote it. Do you want to tell a little bit of that story about how his essay got in here?
Yeah, Jay Herbert and I have been friends for a long time, and I was absolutely encouraging him to throw his hat in the ring for the position. And we knew that he was interested, but I don't think they were even advertising the position at the point where we asked him to write. So then he wrote this, what I thought was a really great essay, very provocative and thought-provoking for me, and a great place to kind of riff from. And then he got the nomination, which is, in our denomination, it's very rare to be nominated and not elected. And we were going to go to press just before General Assembly. And so I called him. I think I texted him twice and called him once to make sure I was on solid ground. I kept saying, Jay Herbert, if you want a chance to back out, now's your chance. And finally he wrote back and said, will you leave me alone and stop bothering me? I wrote the piece, I meant it, and that's exactly why I'm doing the position. So publish the damn thing. So it was great.
Yeah, so there is a chance we may get to visit with Jay Herbert later in this month if his schedule clears up. And if so, I'll announce that and make sure everyone's invited to come to that conversation. He's always electrifying to speak with and just a great presenter live. So I hope that we do get that opportunity to talk with him. But failing that, this will be the last in our series on faithful resistance. I will be doing more resistance seminars later in the year with other contributors on other topics, but this will be the last one on this book. And so today we just want to kind of go through some of the parts where Rick was responding to the contributors and some of the thoughts that he had responding to them, but then also some of the thoughts that have come up since then through the process of talking about and sharing this book, because I know, Rick, you've been invited to some congregations and to some communities to talk to them about it. And whenever that happens, I think there's something new that you learn in the process of doing that.
Agreed.
So let's just start with, kind of looking toward the front of the book. The first chapter is about the border, and it's about immigration and the sanctuary movement. And we had Allison Harrington on, and she just was awesome because she's always awesome there.
Yeah, she
but
pisses me off.
You also, in your response to that chapter, you give an interpretation of the parable of the what you call the parable of the third slave, what is often called the parable of the talents. That is a new interpretation for many people. I've heard it a couple times, but a lot of people who read this book talked to me and said, I've never heard that interpretation. So do you want to talk a little bit about that interpretation and how you got to it and why you think it's powerful?
Sure. I mean, I've always been troubled by that parable, what we call the parable of the talents. I was raised on it the way I think probably most of us have been raised on it, which is that God gives us talents and we're expected to employ our talents for the good of the kingdom. And if we do, our reward will be great in heaven or something close to that, right? And the problem with that, of course, is that it breaks down on a number of levels, the most important of which for me is that if you interpret the parable that way, then clearly God is supposed to be this taskmaster, this person who goes away and entrusts the slaves with the talents the responsibility for multiplying the talents. And in the interaction with the third slave calls him out and says, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter seed. And so I was afraid, and I hid your talent in the ground. And the man responds, you knew, did you, that I was a harsh man, reaping where I did not sow, gathering where I did not scatter seed? He doesn't even try to deny it, right? And this is not a vision that I can find of God really anywhere else in the Christian New Testament. So I've always been troubled by it and frankly avoided the text for years. And then I think I was in Guatemala, actually, when someone first really opened this text up for me in a new way. I was working for SEDEPCA, which is the Evangelical Center for Pastoral Studies in Central America. And I went to a class that was being taught on it. And there was a theologian, I don't remember now who it was, who opened it up. It was not new material. A number of really creative theologians have worked the text in this way. But for me, it just blew me out of the water because it said, first of all, talents is not the way we use the talents in English today. What talents meant was 15 years' wage. It was a unit of measurement of financial success or financial wealth. And so to give 5 talents to one of these slaves is a lifetime salary. It's 75 years worth of income. It's no small deal we're talking about. And the only way you can double your money in first century Palestine is by lending it out at exorbitant interest rates and then holding the note on the person's land who has taken the loan so that when they can't pay, you collect on their land, which is why this guy had he was the equivalent of agribusiness or multinational corporations in our world today. He had so much land he couldn't manage it all, and he was giving it out, parceling it out to trusted servants while he traveled to try and see his various holdings. So you turn it upside down like that. It's not about what I think about as talents. It's how am I going to master double your money for you, right? Mm-hmm. So the first slave says, here you go, I doubled your money. The second slave says the same. They're both rewarded with very interesting language. Enter into the joy of your master, right? And so the hinge of the text really is the very first line in this text. Normally if it's some kind of a metaphor for the kingdom of heaven, it'll say the kingdom of heaven is like. But this text begins, it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves. And I actually was so convinced that the interpretation I was being given in this workshop was wrong that I went to 2 biblical scholars and said, I don't speak the original language, but I want to know, how is this supposed to be translated? And they said, no, the NRSV gets it right. The New Revised Standard Version, where it says, it is as if a man going on a journey, really gets it right. And there are versions that actually totally convolute that text and say the kingdom of heaven is like, but it's a total convolution of the original text. So in that text, if you read it that way, what is so upending about it for me is that at the end of the story, the third slave becomes a hero. He says, the only way to double your money would have been to take advantage of my weaker neighbors, and I refused to do that. So here, you can have what is yours. And it becomes actually, though he says I was afraid, he in fact acts in a mode of resistance that I think is very courageous. And I think that's a lesson too, right? That sometimes being courageous does not necessarily being fearless, right? I think we're in situations where a little bit of fear is probably a good thing. The question is, how do we move beyond the fear and take action?
Right. Well, I mean, he knew that there were going to be consequences, and he was right? There were consequences. He was cast out.
He didn't get to enter into the joy of his master, that's for sure. He was effectively banished to the outer darkness, by which they mean he was put outside of the economic, the economic miracle that was being worked there, right? I think he was sent back to be a poor peasant like all the other poor suckers whose money was being taken away from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so another aspect of this reading that I think is so powerful for me is that if we're honest about our society, and we rarely are when it comes to our economics, because we're all embedded in a system and trained to think of that system as the only way or the best way. But if we're honest about the way our economics work, the only way to double your money in our current society is also to profit off of the labor of other people. Wall Street and the mechanisms that we have in our society for turning some money into more money is principally to benefit from other people's labor. As it often is appropriately said, what profit basically is unpaid labor. And so the truth of the parable that a person who seeks to take money and turn it into more money at root is engaged in exploitation. And one thing I've heard commented about is that the slave putting the talents in the ground is more than just resisting the master's action. It's also symbolic in the sense that he points to the fact that, hey, I put it in the ground like you would put a seed in the ground, and guess what? Nothing grew, right? Like, it didn't produce anything, because money isn't life-giving. It isn't money is dead, inherently. It isn't
Right.
It isn't like a seed, which if you put it in the ground will grow and produce more things. Money only makes more money if you take it from someone.
Ched Myers has pointed out that the irony of burying this in the ground would not have been lost on first century Palestinian farmers, right? That they would have known exactly what that statement meant, the symbolism of that statement. So, I think what you're saying, for me, points to the power of this text, which is that one of the most insidious ways that empire works is to separate us from the fact that whatever we have has come at someone else's expense, right? And the stock market today is a classic example of that, right? We put our money in the stock market, and even those of us who try to be somewhat responsible about that as we do that and think about how our investments work, the truth is, at the end of the day, somebody somewhere is working hard and probably not being paid a reasonable wage, while someone else is profiting from their labor in a significant way. And we just get totally removed from that, and somehow it becomes a moral act to responsibly invest. And I'll be honest, I'm caught in that. I expect all of us are caught in that at some level if we're middle-class Americans and we've got pensions and even some savings.
Yeah. So in the comment threads, Matt Price is asking, in the phrase at the beginning of that parable, "It will be like," do you have a sense of what the "it" refers to?
Yeah, I think what he's saying is, here's the way the world works, right? It is as if a man going on a journey, right? He's saying, this is the way the world around you works. Everybody would have known, right, as soon as he started telling the story, that this is in fact the way their world worked. And that's why it's important to look at the whole chapter, because Ched's take on this, which I find intriguing, Ched Myers' take on this, is that the first pericope in the 25th chapter is the story of the 10 talents, right? I'm sorry, not the 10 talents, the bridesmaids, the 10 bridesmaids. Yeah. And 5 of them trim their lamps and they're ready to go into the party, and the other 5 have foolishly used their oil. And Ched has suggested that this is basically a literary device to say, get ready, something significant is about to happen here, right? And then you lay out, here's how the way the world works in the second story of this chapter. And then, of course, the third story in this chapter is the one that, for many, many of us, certainly myself and many others, is kind of a reigning text for us as Christians. It's the separation of the nations, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, the day of judgment, right? And so I believe that what's going on is Jesus is naming in the first story, here's what we're up against, right? And in the second story, he's saying, here's the kind of economy I'm talking about. It's the one where we look out for the person who is hungry and thirsty and naked and sick and in prison, and we care for those people. And that's where the power of the thing comes together, is when you look at the whole thing together.
Certainly, if you look at the master in the second parable and the talents parable, and then you look at the returning king in the third parable, and where the people are being sent, that master is not going to be among the sheep. In that, he is not going to be one of those who looked out for the poor and the sick and the naked and the imprisoned. So there's an interesting sort of like dynamic wherein the master who judges the servant in the second parable implicitly is going to be judged in the third parable, and it's not going to be a kind judgment either.
Well, and if you'll allow me, I mean, that's exactly the problem we have politically at this particular moment in the United States, right? I find it mystifying. I was thinking about this just again yesterday, that so many Christians in this country could bring themselves to not just vote for, but affirm and lift up the values that Donald Trump represents, or at least write off the things that they don't believe are real in the interest of some greater good that they imagine, when it seems to me that Donald Trump is exactly what's represented by this master in this particular story, right? It's the values of take advantage of anybody you can. I mean, he was unbelievably shameless in the campaign at saying, yeah, I took advantage of people. I didn't pay it. Why should I pay something if I don't have to? right? Why should I pay my taxes? Why should I pay the contractors? Why should I pay
Right.
my workers and my laborers? So it's exactly the kind of ethic we're talking about here.
And continues to be shameless in, going to his own resorts on a more than once a week basis, and having the Secret Service rent facilities in Trump Tower and all that. Like there's no attempt to hide the sense in which a naked grab for wealth is part of his ethos. So,
and then let's just be fair, right? I think there's a pretty direct correlation between the role of the first two slaves and some of our Democratic leaders as well, right? So we all find a way to collude. The question is, how shameless are we willing to be in the project, right? And I don't think Hillary Clinton was going to be an all-star when it came to looking out for the interests of those who were most at risk in our world today. So if what you're looking for is the perfect politician who's going to represent these kinds of gospel values, I think you're going to look your whole lives and not find that person.
So because there's so much to get through here, I want to jump into the second chapter of the book in your response to Ananda Barclay's piece on Black Lives Matter, which is excellent. And the talk with her just went well as well. But you tell a story in that second chapter that I think is really powerful. And I wonder if, without maybe getting into too much detail, you could give us the salient points of that story, the story of the First Presbyterian Church of York, and how that is so illustrative of kind of the dynamic that goes on in our churches and goes on in sort of what I think of as white, well-meaning liberalism.
Yeah, so I think I can tell the story fairly quickly. I grew up in a church where my dad was an associate minister for 18 years. I was 4 years old the year he moved there, and he left there the year I graduated from college. The church represented everything about my formation. I every Sunday morning I was in church for hours. All of my activity was revolved around the church. I dated through my youth group in the church. I worked for the church, working weddings and those kinds of things, and to make pin money during high school. Everything about my formation really was wrapped up in that church. I love that church. I loved it then, and I still love it today. And there's this wild reality that I'm still trying to figure out how to come to grips with, which is that in 1965, the First Presbyterian Church was largely a white congregation, almost entirely a white congregation. And I'm distracted because the dog's barking. I think I'm going to take a moment and go stop the dog. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Hold that thought, okay?
Yep.
She'll bark all day.
For anyone who is watching as well, if you do go ahead and go to the page where this video is showing, and you can type comments into the chat threads. We're getting some comments in and questions, and I'll make sure to get those comments to Rick so that he can answer them, or if the question is for me, I can answer it as well.
Sorry.
Yep.
I would have to pretend for the next hour that she's not barking, and that's not going to work. So First Presbyterian Church in 1965 merged with a much smaller African-American church that could no longer maintain itself financially, is my understanding, called Faith Presbyterian Church. And a really cool little side story is that one of my closest friends today and I discovered that he was a child of faith in the late 1950s, and I was a child of York in the late 1960s. These two churches that merged. And we didn't discover that until we'd known each other for years. And so anyway, in 65, they did the merger. And in many ways, I think they did a lot right. I understand that there were African-Americans from Faith who were put on the session. The folks joined the choir. They were teaching in Christian Ed. Many of my teachers actually were African-American women in the Christian Ed program there. It was a fully integrated move in many, many ways. And in 1967, late 67, 68, 69, there were a series of incidents in downtown York that were called riots, but by any reasonable measure probably should have been called protests. And when the protest broke out, the immediate response of the police was to fight back. And in fact, 30 years later, the former chief of police, who was by then the mayor, and a lot of other people were actually tried finally for what took place, and discovered that they were proven to have, at the very least, armed young white gangs to fight back against African American uprising. So a woman named Lily Bell Allen was actually killed. She was the mother of a 7-year-old, and she was visiting family members, and they turned down the wrong street, and someone a white man shot into the car and murdered her. And right about that same time, there was an incident where there was a police officer exposed in a turret in an armored vehicle driving down the street, and a sniper shot him, and he died within several weeks. And what interests me about the story is that I didn't learn any of that story growing up at First Presbyterian Church. And when I went back to try and learn more about it, I couldn't find any record that there was actually any consciousness within the congregation that this was taking place. Though, what is clear is that our African American members lived in the neighborhoods where these shootings were taking place and where the protests and the riots were going on. They clearly were impacted by it. But when I look, I've searched through the old news archives, and I can't find the names of any of the pastors of the big wealthy white congregations in town showing up at the Crispus Attucks Community Center to stand with African Americans in that moment. And I haven't done a careful search, but a cursory search has led me to believe that there was no conversation about it whatsoever, even in the session meeting of First Presbyterian Church of York. And when I talk to my own dad, who's a great guy, he basically says, honestly, I don't remember us ever having a conversation about this. He arrived there right in the middle of that time, and his memory is that there was no conversation at all.
Yeah, and so this story to me is just, literally National Guard, tanks going down the streets, and nothing mentioned about it in church. To me, it illustrates something about something that's very true about the way our churches often function, which goes beyond mere sort of maybe a mere unawareness to sort of like a willful disengagement, a willful blindness, because there's a certain point when like a tank is rolling down your street and you don't it doesn't make you sit up and pay attention, that there has to be some pretty powerful mechanisms at play encouraging people to not engage with that.
Except, you know what, Eric? I don't think it is willful. I think the point is that the tanks weren't rolling down the streets of the white pastors in that church, or most of the white congregants in that church. And so when that happens, honestly, I rode my bicycle back and forth from our house on South George Street in York, 4 miles into town, all through my childhood and my teenage years. And I had to ride right down the Duke Street, which went through the African American and the Puerto Rican neighborhoods. And I never really saw what was there. In fact, I was trained not to look. I was trained, because it was a slightly dangerous act to ride my bike down that street, to just keep my eyes on the road right in front of my handlebars and not look up. So I never even knew what the Crispus Attucks Community Center was, right? I didn't know what the bodegas, the Puerto Rican bodegas were, or what was going on inside them. And it was years before I was able to kind of pull back the blinders and see what was going on there. So if there's an act of will in this, it wasn't an individual act, it was a structural act. And I think that's actually the real point here.
Right. Well, and that's what I'm trying to say is the being trained not to look. It's not, and I don't mean a person's, choosing individually to not see,
right,
so much as I mean we are trained to not see. It's not as if I don't think it's fair to attribute either to mere accident. Like, it's not like we got to a place where whole bunches of people don't see things, and it's just chance. It just kind of fell out that way. I think it's actually more to do with the fact that we have structural systems in place that are designed and intended to encourage a non-awareness of what's going on.
But isn't that, actually, I think that's at the fundamental, that's the heart of each of the 5 chapters in the first half of this book, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ways in which we are trained, encouraged, even forced not to see what's going on by the structures around us, whether it's about empire and what it means to be a beneficiary of empire, or a citizen of empire who experiences all of the benefits, or in this case, racism and the the reality that my white privilege comes at someone's expense, and that it is in fact a phenomenal privilege. Or in the third chapter, the issues around the ways in which we're taught. I had lunch with Abby Mohop, who I think you interviewed around
Yes.
the third chapter, right? I had lunch with her a couple of weeks after you did that interview with her. And Abby was saying, she had tears in her eyes. She was saying, Rick, what do I have to do to help people understand that this is a crisis now, right? This isn't an intellectual conversation about what might happen someday, right? But we're trained to assume that there's no immediacy in this crisis, right? Same thing with Rabia and the conversation about Christian supremacy, right? Or Christian superiority or exclusivism. I didn't really recognize any of that until I came to live in a multi-faith community and was forced to kind of peel back the blinders on my again and look at, wow, what does it mean that I carry this kind of privilege? And then the last chapter, I keep thinking I'm done with the LGBTQ question, but now we're into a whole new conversation that's stretching me and pushing me about what it means to be cisgender. And I think that's exactly the kind of conversations we ought to be having. And what I'm learning is if I'm sharp and aware and faithful, I'll still be having these conversations, God willing, when I'm 90.
Right. And that last one on continuing to learn from members of the LGBTQ community who are teaching. We have a mutual friend who is about to publish a book that I'm reading right now that's about looking at historical figures and looking at their lives and pointing out that, of course, queer people have been with us all the time. That's her language using it, but that's the sense is, she talks about Abraham Lincoln in the book, and she talks about other people who we have just grown accustomed to assuming are straight cisgendered people, because that, even without having to say that out loud, that is the overwhelming lens through which we are trained to view the entire world. If someone isn't explicitly identifying themselves as other than the normal is straight and cisgendered. So when we look at history, and for most of history, many of these questions for the discipline of history, most of these questions about gender and sexuality have not been forefront in the conversation. Because of that, we just assume everyone who we know as a historical figure, they're all straight and they're all cisgendered. And so her book, just simply by pointing out, here's 23 people, and this is the actual stories of their lives and ways that they lived, that now we would use language for them that would be somewhere in a queer spectrum of identities. And that, for me, even as someone who, as you say, I've been in this conversation for 20 years now and learning about it, and still it's amazing to me to just sit back and go, you're absolutely right. I have always treated this as if this was a recent phenomenon, even though intellectually, of course, I know it's not. Obviously, I know it's not, but it's one thing to know it intellectually and another to sort of absorb it experientially and be like, of course, I need to look back at our history and see it far more complexly than I have.
Which is why it's important for you and I to have this conversation with each other, right? Because, and if I've got to take responsibility for pushing other people who are like me, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, privileged in pretty much every way. It's my responsibility to talk with folks who are like me. And I don't blame folks who are not in those categories of privilege for being exhausted by the task of constantly having to work to pull back those blinders for us.
Mm-hmm. In the comment threads, Matt Price is saying, on the topic of not talking about what's happening around us, he noticed, and he's curious about how many of our churches addressed the missile strike last week. How many stayed quiet because it was Palm Sunday and they wanted to stick with the liturgy, or they did something like mention it in a checklist during a prayer, and then that's it, never bring it up again.
Boy, I think Matt's opening up a whole can of worms, right? Because the truth is that the church hates ambiguity, right? We want a clear hero and a clear villain, and we don't have a clear hero and a clear villain here, right? Nobody would make the case that Assad is a hero who respects human rights, right? And some of us have been clamoring for some kind of a more, a less passive, more active response, though not necessarily a military response, but some kind of response. So, I think that many, I'd say most of the pastors I know are caught in this kind of dilemma of our own making, which is that if we identify Assad as evil, then any action to try and take Assad down a peg has got to be viewed as at least morally neutral, if not morally positive, right? So I think that's actually the box that a lot of us are caught in. And frankly, we're afraid, and I don't blame us for being afraid of the conversation in our congregations, because we don't know how to handle the fact that people disagree with one another about this, and how to disagree well with one another.
Yeah, and this is, I think, also because these things are difficult and people don't want to do hard work. And here's this is, I really appreciate Don Mead, who's a member of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, wrote a pretty thorough paper about possible nonviolent responses to Syria.
It's pretty fabulous.
And it's on the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship website. If you haven't had a chance, I'll put the link in the description below. But like, it's that sort of work that I think is so critical for us to actually engage with, and to be aware of that there are people out there doing this work. It frustrates me so much when I get in these conversations and people like who have never put more than 30 seconds thought into a situation just be like, well, what would you do? There's no solution. And I'm like, there are people out there working on solutions. There are people out there really trying hard to do this complicated work of doing something that's not simplistic, that doesn't reduce down to, well, they're bad people, so bomb them, or, well, there's nothing we can do because if we bomb them, it'll get worse, so therefore do nothing. Like, there's a lot more depth and nuance we can get into there. And so, but that work is hard. So if we can't do that in a in a 2-minute conversation, people want to give up and throw their hands up and walk away. So,
right. Well, and in this case, around this particular question, I heard a fabulous radio interview the other day where the person being interviewed was making the point that no one is talking about all the ways in which the diplomacy options that the Obama administration chose have in fact been phenomenally successful, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't still a huge problem going on, right? That Assad, I believe Assad to be as close to evil personified as you can get right now. I think the guy is pretty much entirely without moral compunction or persuasion. And I believe that much of what he's done in this war is evil, and I have wrestled repeatedly with what a more significant response would look like on the part of the church, for instance. But as you say, Don's article is really, really helpful. I actually went back and reread it last week because I was missing that piece of the analysis that was coming out anywhere in the media.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I more or less have grown to understand that anytime anyone in our media or any one in national conversation begins to sort of use any entity, organization, group of people or whatever as a sort of shorthand for bad, ISIS is a current stand-in for that. And it used to be Al-Qaeda before that. And, before that it was Saddam Hussein, and before that it was the Russians or Soviet Union or whatever. Like we always have a foil, a bad guy of a kind in our public media narrative. Anytime that happens, no matter how awful the instances of evil that they point to are, there's always a simplification going on, the purpose of which isn't actually to deal with that problem, but which is to enable the usage of resources and stuff in our own system, which itself, it ends up having evil impacts. It's the ability for us to continue to expend so much on our military. We need a foe out there in order to be able to justify ludicrous, expenditure of resources on military and imbalances of wealth in our own society. So, that's the danger there is that you point to something evil out there and it becomes a mechanism which we use for further evil purposes.
Absolutely.
And I want to jump a little bit ahead. Chapter 7 is is one that has generated a little bit of controversy in some of the responses to it, because it takes a pretty critical look at our theological education system at our seminaries. And you and I both have lots of friends who work in and are very loyal to some of those seminary institutions. I mean, I'm educated at a seminary, and I value some of that. So we have those connections. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Well, I thought your interview with John and Laura and Jen who were the ones who co-wrote that essay for Chapter 7 was fabulous, and they continue to push me and to help me to think creatively about these questions. I just think I think we've got a problem here, like everywhere else, which is that we are actually preparing people for the wrong church. And I don't know, I don't have easy answers for how we're going to fix that. Honestly, I could easily imagine that if the cards had been dealt a little bit differently, I would be some kind of an administrator or even a president of a theological institution, right? And if I were in that position, I have friends who are presidents of some of our theological institutions. If I were in their position, I would be doing my level best to remake that institution in a way that would make it relevant and important for the future. So all of that is true, and we have this problem, which is that we are preparing people to be pastors to a church of 40 years ago or 50 years ago, and not for the church that I think is coming in the next 20 to 30 years. And further, we're making promises to those pastors, those students, as we educate them, that if they play by the rules, we will take care of them the entire time, right? We'll help them to be secure financially and to raise a family and to be, effectively what we're promising them is a comfortable middle-class life. And I think the promise itself is morally bankrupt. We can't promise that. And the fact that we have this implicit promise is really problematic. And then you've got the added problem, which is that we're telling them, oh, wait, by the way, part of the equation is that you've got to go deep, deep into debt, most of you, in order to do this. Though I have to say there are a few seminaries that have really stretched to try and figure out how to offer seminary education debt-free that I think are really being creative. They're really looking at that set of questions in an important way. But at the end of the day, we've got a problem, which is that we can't afford, in my judgment, a professional ministerial class for very much longer. And while that will create some problems, I think it's actually going to create opportunity too. And I note that in my own church, we've been without a pastor for 2.5 years. And while there are many struggles in our church, our theological conversation is no less rich now than it was under the really capable leadership of our commission ruling elder, who was there for 7 years before that period began, before we began this time without a pastor. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think what's going to matter in the next iteration of church is that all of us become more theologically literate, or at least capable of mining the unbelievable resources that exist on the internet in a way that is thoughtful and thought-provoking. And so I'm not saying that theological education isn't necessary. I'm just saying I think that what Jen and Laura and John are doing is far closer to what we're looking for. It's not about a certification. It's not about a promise that you're going to have a career. It's about just, hey, I'm really unbelievably curious about the ways in which I am called theologically in this world, and what the theological intersections are with our current political time. And I want to study those things. I think we're going to need that study, but it can't look like it's looked in the past.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the greatest strengths of what they're doing at Underground Seminary is its embeddedness in a community. Is that the part of the curriculum, part of the role is that you have to participate in Church of All Nations life. You have to have a leadership role in that community to be part of the seminary. It's part of the seminary role. And our seminaries are trying to do this through internship programs and CPE and other things like that. But it's all extrinsic to the process, right? Like at seminary, you're actually kind of siloed away from church. And I'm actually the exact example of the worst of this, because I actually came to seminary. I had not grown up in the church. I was not raised in the church. I didn't have a church community that was backing me to go to seminary per se. I actually came to a church and said, hey, I want to go to seminary. Will you support me through the ordination process? Like, that was the first overture I made to that church. Not, hey, can I be part of your communal life for, a decade and get to know you? but hey, I have this career direction I'm headed, and I want you to support me in that career direction. And of course, they were enthusiastic and supported me. So like I did it in the worst possible way. Like I went through the process going at it as like vocational training and didn't have any like roots in a church community. And I recognize that now as a real flaw in my educational past. And I think that that's pretty common in the seminary system, in that it functions more along the university model than it does serve as an outgrowth or a function or a part of the church.
Yeah, part of community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are Church of All Nations is a fabulous example, but it's not the only example, and it's not a new idea. I mean, most of my formation happened in and through the Latin American church, and I've got colleagues who are still around and still amazing teachers to us. Ross and Gloria Kinsler come to mind, and who are retired now in Southern California. They were leaders in the 1960s in what was then called theological education by extension. I had lunch last week with Alice Winters from St. Petersburg, Florida, retired now in St. Petersburg, who spent a lifetime working in Colombia, and most of the early part of her career as a mission worker was setting up theological extension classes. And the whole thing was about recognizing that it was a luxury that most people could not afford to leave behind their families and their vocation or their work and go to seminary for 3 years. And so the idea was we take the theological education to them wherever they are. Carla Cole is another one who's doing this work still today out of the Latin American University in San Jose, Costa Rica. Really amazing people who have been trying for years to figure out how to support people who feel called to gain a greater level of theological grounding and underpinning. And someone pointed out to me early on in my career that in the United States you go to a seminary and then you work out your call. And in Latin America and many other places in the world, it's exactly the opposite. You get called, you begin pastoring in some way because you feel called to do so, and then you realize you really need to fill in around the edges with the theological education, and so you do it as a second act, not as a first act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot going on in the chat right now that I want to highlight that is related to this. In talking there, David Ensign is saying he loves the direction that you're talking about with what underground seminary is doing, and it makes him wonder about the situations of the current generation of pastors like me. He says,
"Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you guys."
And then Jeffrey Todd also is talking about a little bit what we were referring to before we got into the seminary conversation about the difficult conversations, people wanting to avoid those difficult conversations. And he says that the 204th, the 1992 GA adopted a document called Seeking to be Faithful, Guidelines for Presbyterians During Times of Disagreement. And he says that his church has recently rediscovered this document and is using it as a prelude to some of those tough talks. He says the discussions are difficult enough. Sometimes it helps to prepare the soil before planting.
Yeah, so let me take that one and then go back to the first question from David. I just want to say he's absolutely right. I've used that document repeatedly. It's fabulous, and if people don't know about it, you should. And it's easy to find online now, so you can look for it. And it really does help congregations that want to talk about hard things in a way that is respectful and thoughtful and careful with one another, which I think is important. I don't think it's particularly important we live in such a polarized world, and I'm not looking for a world that moves in lockstep, nor am I interested in a world or a church which refuses to recognize challenging issues that are before us. So I think having some tools is a really good piece of the puzzle. And let me just go back to David's comment. I don't mean to be entirely, I don't want to dismiss the challenge, right? So I guess what I'd say about folks who are my colleagues, who are 25 to 55, 60 years old, who are kind of set up for the current style of ministry and who really are dependent on it economically. The first act, I think, is that we should turn off the spigot. I think we need to stop feeding more students into the system as if we can make a promise to them similar to one that we made to my father, who's now 74 and retired, right? And similar to the one that we made to you and David and many others. We just need to stop the spigot and say, if you come to seminary, we got no promises for you here. Right now, let's work together to figure out what it's going to look like. But it's not a perfect world. And guess what? We're going to have to figure out what multivocational living looks like, the same way most of my friends are doing who are younger than I am, right? That's not unique to pastors. I know lots of people who are trying to spin together different pieces of career in order to hold themselves together economically. So let's turn off the spigot, or at least let's have a thoughtful conversation about that. And then I think we have a different conversation, which is what does it look like to help the church through this very challenging time? And I'm in one of those churches. I'm in a church that's down to its last 30 members. We have 15 to 20 on a good Sunday morning in worship. We're struggling to hold it all together. It's clear that we're never going to go back to a pastoral kind of a professional pastor kind of model, nor is it quite clear where we're going to go from here. In the absence of that, this church is not, a wonderful example of how we're going to do something different. It's a church that's caught right in the midst of this. And so I think a vocation is going to be to help these churches really wrestle with those things and kind of move through this process carefully.
And maybe I might add to this, as someone who is in the system now, that I think that with stopping the spigot makes sense as a good starting place, but I don't want to rest there too much, because I think then it's a little bit too comfortable to be like, whew, I just snuck in. I just got in before the wall dropped. And I think there is a sense that we need to start thinking about and talking about the unfaithfulness that has been the professional model of ministry, the expectation that to be a minister should mean that you're entitled to a middle-class lifestyle with a house and a car and a pension and healthcare and all of these things that are part of sort of a middle-class vision of America. Not saying that these things also aren't, like, we might talk about them as basic human rights, about people needing to have healthcare and things like that, but that's a broader conversation, and precisely that's what we have avoided doing by making them attached to professionalism, to professions. So I think that what we need to do is to begin to talk about what it would look like for us to not just say we're ending that, but to say that we need to like go back and undo and reverse some of that. So what do we do with our board of pensions? What do we do with our foundation? What do we do with these resources that we have accumulated under an ethos which is unfaithful? How do we faithfully divest ourselves of them? How do we faithfully pay reparations within our church community, that we say, okay, how do we ensure, for example, that women and minorities who have had a very hard time getting calls, or when they do, they get calls that are part-time or not installed positions, or positions which are not eligible for all of the benefits that our clergy guild provides us. How do we rectify those injustices and undo those distinctions we have drawn, and some of those? So that might mean some of us like voluntarily abdicating the promise that was made to us that we're going to have a certain level of wealth and comfort, and giving that up, paying it back to others. Which
there's a book to be written here, honestly, because I think that's exactly right. And the question is, how do those of us who have experienced so much privilege in this system work together with those who have not been as privileged in the system, or who have had really the deck stacked against them, to address these questions of privilege in a way that does not unduly endanger those folks or their families? That's a hard set of questions, and I think so. The question, and I guess I would say this: that's a big picture question that I think we really need to take on. And simultaneously, I wouldn't have any of these conversations without what I think is the kind of the premise of the book that you and I worked so hard on, which is that it's all about community. And I don't think we can afford to dismantle what we've got until we've got a new understanding of what Christian community is really going to look like, and what it's going to mean to support one another, right? I can't find anywhere in the Bible that says, pay your leaders well enough so that they'll never be a burden to you or anyone else, right? But that's what you'd think the Bible says based on the way our system works. In fact, what the Bible says is the opposite, right? Which is, give up what you've got, everybody put what you've got on the table, create a circle, share what you've got, and make sure no one goes without. We have nothing like that in our current understanding of what, and frankly, I know some folks in evangelical churches who are far closer to this than we are in the United States. So I just think we're going to have this conversation in a far deeper way than we've had it so far. And I would really like to be a part of those conversations.
I mean, I'm again and again getting told and taught that if we just put at the center the people who are the most vulnerable, the people who are most excluded, it works out for those of us
It
that are privileged.
automatically figures everything else out.
Right, it does, because if the people who are the most vulnerable, the most excluded, the most deprived have enough, then everyone else has enough. Like if we make sure that trans and bisexual and gay and lesbian and people of color and immigrants and refugees in our own communities are being cared for, then that will be, that by extension ensure that everyone is cared for. It's centering the most vulnerable, which is a process which lifts up. But it's frightening, because it's frightening for those of us who are accustomed to being centered, to suddenly no longer be the center, and because we assume that it's going to work the way that white supremacy works, which is not a process of centering the most vulnerable. It's a process of centering the most powerful, which inherently excludes. It creates a pyramid, right? So we think we're just going to create a new pyramid with different people at the top. But this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about always intentionally centering those at the bottom, which doesn't create a pyramid. It creates a level playing field. So
preach it. I'm right with
you.
So
we're almost done to the hour, and there are a couple questions in the thread, so I want to make sure they got a chance to ask them of you while you're on. Joe Ritako has asked, and this is a little bit of a structural question, more looking at the last couple chapters of the book, my chapter and Jay Herbert's chapter. He wants to know if you have looked at the organization or polity of groups like Reform Judaism or Unitarian Universalists or UCC as models for considering ways for the PSUSA going forward. Since we're thinking about how to restructure the PSUSA, have you looked at any of these other organizations and seen, is there stuff there that you might emulate or?
Well, the short answer is no. I have not looked at any of those that you've just mentioned with great care, although I've got colleagues in all of those worlds and I have a passing familiarity with all of them. I think, what I don't want to give up as we move into whatever it is that's coming next is what I think has been the real strength of the Presbyterian Church, which is our polity. So I'm a huge fan of our form of government and our Book of Order. And although I think it becomes a problem when we keep adding more and more and more rules to it to try and keep people in line. So Paul Hooker and others did some really creative work on our Book of Order in the last 5 or 6 years to try and kind of streamline it again. And I actually think that's all really important. I'm far more concerned about the ways that we organize the work of the church than I am about our governance. And by that I mean I think we have corporatized our approach to the act of being community in a way that is entirely problematic. It's problematic at every level, whether it's local congregation or mid-councils, and it's especially problematic at the national level of the church. And the reason it's problematic is because a corporation's clear and primary goal is to save itself. And our form of government actually says we should be called to risk even our very being to become who we expect God is calling us to be. So somehow, I think what we've got to do is figure out how we dismantle a very carefully and intricately constructed corporate structure and reclaim something that looks far closer to the early church, or even the church of 150 years ago here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important when we talk about the corporate structure of the church, to acknowledge a couple things. One is that it's hard to dismantle that, partially because it is the structure and ethos of our society around us. It's supported by so many external institutions that our society assumes as normative. So dismantling it is extremely countercultural and extremely unintuitive for most people. It goes against what we see and experience around us everywhere else. And the other aspect of that is that even though it is everywhere else around us, and therefore it seems sort of like permanent and timeless, it's actually very recent and not at all the historical pattern of the church. So being willing to let go of it is something that we need to encourage people to see, that it's like we're only talking about dismantling, say, the last 70 or 80 years of the church, if that, where it's not like, in the scheme of things, it's a blip. as to how the church has historically actually operated. Even though it seems to us like it's forever, it's like people in the pews saying these hymns are the hymns we've always sung, when what they really mean is these are the hymns we sang in my childhood.
Right.
You know, not that these are, you know, the actual ancient timeless liturgy of the church per se, just that these are my personal era and experience of the church.
If I could say one more thing about that quickly, Eric, for anybody who's watching this who did not get to see your interview with Jen and Laura and John on the 7th chapter, I really recommend the last 10 minutes of that interview, because Jen in particular, I think, has a really insightful clarity about one of the most dangerous aspects of the corporatization of church, which is this way that we've cloaked everything we do in committee process, so that no one actually has to take responsibility individually or personally for where the church is or where it's going. And I am right with Jin. He and I have had this conversation. I think he's absolutely right about that. And it's one of the most dangerous parts. And this does infect us at every single level of our denomination. And it's really problematic. Now, what do we do about that? I think we need to be careful, because it's also true that we have among the most egalitarian and open political processes of any denomination that I can think of, right? And I don't want to lose that. But on the other hand, at the end of the day, we not only don't reward, but we actually punish the behavior of people stepping out a little bit to say, hey, I've got vision, I've got a call, let's follow this and see where it leads us. And I think that's really problematic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it works both ways, right? It's egalitarian, but it can also be used to sort of require a kind of uniformity, which presumes as its default, because it has historically been the default, white masculinity and
Right.
middle classedness, and it sort of quietly absorbs an ethos of the dominant culture, and assumes that everyone has to fit into that. So it does. A system which allows for more personal individuality and accountability will allow for a little bit more diversity in leadership as well, because we won't have to assume that everyone has to sort of fit a similar mold.
Yep.
There's a question in there, I think, directly related to this, which is that can you think of an example of how the Presbyterian Church 150 years ago or 100 years ago was different the way it is today, that we might reclaim an aspect with looking back before sort of this big corporate model of church that could be useful to us?
Sure. I mean, the things that come to mind immediately are the women's associations and the mission associations, which in the late 1800s, as far as I can tell, were really driving the foundational characters of the Presbyterian Church, right? And it was entirely about people banding together around common sets of interests and just making things happen. They didn't have staff to point to or to make it happen. They raised money, and they followed people who felt led, and they stepped out and really did things. Now, were there problems? Sure. I can name a significant critique of the way mission operated, the way we understood mission to operate in the late 1800s. So it's not to say that it was a panacea or it was wonderful. It had all the problems of privilege and white privilege in particular that we are finally beginning to articulate in meaningful ways today. But on the other hand, what it lacked was this utter servitude to corporate structure. And it created, I think, much more openness to what are the roots of really being Presbyterian.
Mm-hmm. I think about, and the mission was immediately what I thought of as well. And acknowledging that disclaimer about there was very problematic aspects about mission and its colonial impacts. But the fact that also, missionary was a sacrificial calling. You didn't go into it expecting a middle-class salary. And still that's true with many of our missionaries today. I'm not implying that our missionaries today aren't living sacrificial lives in various ways.
Absolutely.
But that there was this general ethos of like go and accomplish, and that it was that was part of that. And as a result of that, there are parts of the world where Presbyterian means hospital, where Presbyterian means school, where that's what Presbyterians, their impact in the world was, that's what they were known for. This struck me when I went to Israel and Palestine, that in Palestine, Presbyterians are known for their work with Kairos, and more known there. Like I had more luck with people in the streets in Jerusalem knowing what a Presbyterian Presbyterian was than I do with the streets here in Portland, people knowing what a Presbyterian
Absolutely.
is. So like, I think that there's a sense in which, I sometimes talk to churches and I say, wouldn't it be wonderful if you were able to ask people, what does it mean to be Presbyterian? And they had an answer somewhat like they had in the late 1800s for a Presbyterian is a person who builds a hospital. A Presbyterian is a person who builds a school. Well, what if that were the kinds of answers we could get from people today? A Presbyterian is a person who advocates for racial justice in our communities. That's the answer to the question of what is a Presbyterian from an outsider. Like, I think that is an ethos we could recover, we could recapture. Whereas now, a Presbyterian, if anyone knows what a Presbyterian is in our culture and community at all, they immediately lean into polity things. They lean into or stereotypes of being frozen chosen. The thinnest and least substantive and least gospel-centered possible identities are the only ones that people can point to of what it means to be Presbyterian.
This, Eric, this may be a good place to try and finish, because I think it's kind of the point I finished the book with, right? Which is, by any reasonable measure, the Presbyterian Church is going to shrink dramatically over the next decade. When I was elected moderator, we were 2.4 million members. Now we're down under 1.9 million members. I think any reasonable estimate says that we're going to be closer to 1 million by a decade or 12, 15 years from now. And as that happens, we have two choices. One choice that I think is going to have all the momentum behind it and is going to be very hard to fight is going to be this: we need to be a little bit of everything to absolutely everybody. We need to not talk about anything controversial because somebody else might get offended enough to leave. And we just try and make a big enough tent. But at the end of the day, the danger is we actually don't stand for anything. No one knows who we are, what we believe, or why it matters, right? Or we can choose to really sharpen our identity over the next decade so that as we shrink, we actually shrink with intentionality, and we welcome the people who are willing to say, yeah, the things that you, Eric, are lifting up around racial justice and standing with people who have been most excluded in our world and giving genuine opportunity in leadership, offering real leadership opportunity to all people, wherever they come from, regardless of their level of privilege. If we could be known for those things, I think that's something that's going to mean something. I ask groups all the time, when I say the word Quaker, what do you think of, right? And people immediately say, oh, I think of peace, I think of silence, right? And I think of consensus. And I say, right, do you know there are only 85,000 Quakers in the United States today, right? But everybody I ask knows what a Quaker stands for. They all know. No one I ask knows what a Presbyterian stands for. And so that's really the central tenet of the book is I'm begging us to take on these really meaty, challenging questions in a way that is bold and daring and unafraid of the frankly the diminution of the church that's going to happen no matter what. No matter what we do demographically, this church is going to shrink. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I can't find anywhere in the gospel that says we should be this many members, right? It does say go and try and share this message with all people. Fair enough. But I don't think Presbyterians have to be the be all and end all, especially when it comes at the cost of the Methodist Church or the Catholic Church down the street, right? Right now, that's basically what we're doing. We're all competing for the same people who are still willing to identify with a traditional denominational structure. And we all get ecstatic when our numbers go up. It doesn't matter if the people came from a church 2 miles away, right? And I just think we've got it all wrong. What we really need to be doing is getting more and more clear and focused all the time. And I'm so excited. I know we've got to finish. I'll just say that I'm excited by the conversations I'm hearing out there. I'm daunted by the challenges that we confront. I have no easy answers. And I look forward to working with you and with lots of other people on trying to make it work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rick. It has been a really rich conversation, and I know that this conversation is going on in a lot of churches, and that a lot of groups are reading this book and talking about it, and people who've been talking about these ideas since before this book came out and in other ways as well. I'm grateful to everyone who has participated in the live stream and the questions, and everyone who has participated after the fact in watching the videos and sharing them. I hope they continue to be a fruitful source of engagement for anyone who wants to be part of these conversations. conversations. We have been reading through Faithful Resistance, Gospel Visions for the Church in a Time of Empire by Rick Ufford-Chase and many other excellent contributors who are also contained in this book and who were part of this series. These have been Resistance seminars. This is going to be the last one for a little while. I'm going to take a little break as I prepare the next series, but I do plan to do this again in the near future, and I have a lot of excellent contributors lined up. Eliana Maxim from Seattle is going to be with us, as well as hopefully a few people from North Dakota from Standing Rock, and some other organizations and entities that I think are doing great work in the world are going to get on, and we're going to do some more of these seminars like this. Rick, thank you so much for an awesome book, for the opportunity to collaborate with you, and for all of these conversations.
Thank you, Eric.
Take care, everyone.